Hi, welcome to a voiceover PowerPoint presentation on the process of thought. This is in the area of cognitive psychology. When we study psychology, we need to remember that it started out as a philosophy with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and has grown from there. And you don't want to forget that there is philosophy involved with the science of psychology. The first theory that was talked about was the psychodynamic theory that was presented originally by Freud. Uh, Freud's great contribution is naming the unconscious and its components of the id, the ego, and the superego. His theories have been shown not to be totally accurate, although a lot of people still go by them. The biggest thing is that he helped name this construct by known as the unconscious. The next big movement in psychology was when psychology was trying to become a science. It wanted to get respectability, and this is when the behaviorists moved in. I lovingly refer to them as the rat runners. But these are the people that work in laboratories, that believe everything is stimulus response. And later, the cognitivists said, no, we think we can change. And there came the cognitive revolution. And that's what we're going to spend our time on today. Beyond cognitivism, or actually including cognitivism, is humanism. It's a more holistic approach. And if you look at the historical beginnings, it was actually around before cognitive psychology. But in looking at the steps of psychology, it's normally placed after cognitive psychology, because while cognitive includes behaviorism, humanism includes cognitivism. And then beyond cognitivism is the transpersonal or the existential, which starts dealing with our much higher goals than human beings and brings in the spiritual existence of soul and so forth. But today's area we're going to concentrate on is the cognitive psychology and how we think. We're going to look at the computer model of the mind. So first we have the brain. Now the brain is located in the skull, and we can think of the brain as our supercomputer. Okay, it takes in everything. It runs our systems, so you can say that it's in charge of systems management. And we don't have anything in the field of artificial intelligence to even compete with the computing power of the brain. Sometimes we would like our brains to work as straightforward as a computer, but what they can access, what they can remember, what we can put together, we have not been able to duplicate in artificial intelligence. So this computer, our brain, processes 400 billion, that's billion with a B, bits of information per second. Our conscious awareness can only process 2,000 bits per second. Okay, so we cannot possibly process all the information that's available to us. On the brain is another physical item. It runs like a net, like a hairnet, almost, from the back of the brain to the forebrain, and it's called the reticular activating system, or the RAS. And what the reticular system does, or the reticular formation, is it acts like a filter. All the information that comes into us comes in through our five senses. And where you're sitting, if you were to take in all the light that you could see, you would be overwhelmed. Your brain tunes part of this light out. If you could hear all the sounds that that were available to you. You would be overwhelmed by sound. So the reticular activating system acts as this filter in our conscious mind. Our consciousness is our awareness. Remember, we mentioned earlier that we have the conscious and the unconscious. So right now we're talking about the conscious. So what danger, love, fear, and beauty kind of override everything else when it comes into things. They will take over the importance or the precedence that we filter through. And of course, fear and danger get the ultimate precedence. So for example, if you're sitting in your living room and you're reading a book and you're totally into the book or kind of zoned out or maybe even napping, and the fireplace throws a spark out and catches the rug on fire, and you smell smoke, it's your reticular activating system says, danger, danger, wake up, pay attention to what's going on here. It overrides your need to read the book or to sleep or whatever. Does that make sense? All right, next we're going to talk about the mind. And the mind is kind of an ethereal concept. It's also a construct. Where is the mind? You can't find it on autopsy. Native Americans say it's in the heart. Asians look at it as it's made up of energy. You might even go to the Star Wars concept of the Force, that we all have this universal life force, but that's kind of the mind, that we're not sure where the mind is. But in psychology, we've agreed to agree that there is a mind, and it works very closely with the brain. Most people feel that it's in charge of the brain, although sometimes they can't make up their mind about that. The mind is made up of the conscious, that's the awareness we were talking about before, and the subconscious. The behaviorist and the psychodynamic theory talk about the unconscious as opposed to the subconscious. I like to use the term subconscious. I think it's more inclusive, but the subconscious and the unconscious are synonyms, so they can be used synonymously. One thing I want you to remember is that the language of the mind is pictures. We think in pictures. So read this sentence. Were you able to read it? One reason is because we think in pictures. We see the word as a whole, and we don't look at the mistakes. This is another reason you need to proofread your papers before you turn them in. So let's talk about the conscious a minute. We're going to talk about the makeup of the mind. The conscious is kind of like the screen and the keyboard of your computer. Okay? You get the input from the five senses. They go into the supercomputer, the brain that's managing the system. That goes through the reticular activating system. It gets filtered as it goes into the conscious, because consciously we cannot handle all the information that is available to us. It goes to the keyboard, and it's like you hit the enter button. When you hit the enter button, it gives sanction, and it enters into the computer, into the screen, and that's where we perceive, we associate, we evaluate, and we use that information to decide. And this is all a big feedback loop, and it happens in moments. Less than seconds, nanoseconds. It happens quicker than you can snap your finger. This entire process happens incredibly fast, so that we don't even know that we go through these steps to do it. Now let's look at the subconscious. And I talked about hitting the enter button, and anything that gets hit in the enter button gets recorded in the subconscious. Now the subconscious records everything that's available to our senses. Okay, even the stuff that the reticular activating system filters out. So it takes it all in. But if you consciously enter something, you give it sanction. That means you want to remember it. And the more often an idea or opinion is entered, the stronger the program becomes. And the more it becomes a part of our programming. Okay, so the subconscious, think of the subconscious as the hard drive of the computer. Okay? It stores our programs. It helps create our reality. We get the associations and make our decisions from it. Okay? It takes in everything, and it takes it in literally. 80 to 90% of our lives are run by the subconscious. That means we are literally not that aware of everything that's going on to us. This is one reason we sometimes know things that we're not sure how we know them, because our subconscious picks it up. And as I mentioned, it's the hard drive. It takes in everything. Now, the key about the subconscious is that not only does it take it in, it's non-judgmental and very literal. It takes everything in black and white. It doesn't just decide that this is good for you or bad for you, so we're going to use it. If you say, I've lost my keys, it will say, okay, you've lost your keys. It takes it in black and white, literally, non-judgmental. Now, we've talked about we think in pictures, but our thoughts are three-dimensional. While we translate things to pictures, the impact that they have on us is in 3 dimensions. So if you read a word, it's like it gets entered into that computer one time. If you see a picture or think of a picture, it's kind of like it gets entered 10 times. If you have an emotion about it, a feeling, it could be 100 times or 1,000 times. So for example, if I mention or you see the word dog, you get a picture in your mind of what I'm talking about, a dog. It may be your dog or a dog that you just saw that comes to mind. But then if I tell you it's a bulldog, you have another picture in your mind of what the bulldog might look like. Now, if somewhere along the line a bulldog took a bite out of your leg, you may have some terrific emotions about that. And it's going to bring up emotions in you because it's really entered into your subconscious emotionally. So the point of this is that emotions hit the program hard. It's like you enter hundreds or thousands of times when you add emotion to it. So for example, think back to the 2nd grade and think of school in the 2nd grade. Now, my guess is what comes to mind to you first will be something that has emotion tied to it. You won the spelling bee in the 2nd grade. You had a birthday party in the 2nd grade. Those are joyous occasions that have positive emotions tied to them. On the other side, the teacher may have stood you up in front of class and you weren't prepared and you were embarrassed, and now because of this you're fearful of speaking in public because this emotion is so ingrained in you that you can't move on. That's how powerful this is. Now there's a program in the hard drive called the creative subconscious. And the creative subconscious, its main job is to keep us sane. And one way it keeps us sane is to keep the picture straight. So if you imagine that there's a picture on the wall in a room and it's crooked, would that bother you if it was hanging at an angle? For most people, it does. If it doesn't, you have to consciously will yourself to say, that doesn't bother me. But what are the pictures that it keeps straight? What are these pictures? Well, in this case, what we're talking about, when we're talking about behavior and change and our mind and brain working together in the process of thought, we're talking about self-images, okay? And a self-image is exactly that. It's a picture you have of yourself. It's an opinion that you have of yourself. I'm smart. I'm dumb. I'm good at math. I'm bad at math. They're all opinions of ourselves. They become beliefs. We believe them about ourselves. So how many of these self-images do we have? There are hundreds. There are thousands of them. Everything that you do, there's a self-image. If you're a male, you have a self-image of yourself as a man. You have a self-image of yourself as a brother, as a son, as an uncle, as a cousin, as an athlete, as a student, as a professional. The same thing as a woman. You have a self-images of yourself as a woman, a wife, a mother, a daughter, a sister, an aunt. You have self-images of yourself of how you mow the grass, how you do on tests, how you wash the dishes. Everything that we do, we have a self-image of ourselves. Now, these self-images can be extremely powerful and control what we do.
Now, our self-images determine quite often how we act and behave. They come up from the unconscious. They are there. We don't think about them. So I often like to give the example of the clumsy child. Okay, if little Johnny is 3 years old and he comes toddling into the room and trips over the carpet, falls down, doesn't hurt himself. It's kind of funny, actually. And Dad says, boy, he sure is clumsy. Then at dinner that night, he spills his milk, and Mom says, boy, he sure is clumsy. Now, Johnny may not be any more clumsy than any other child. But if this continues to go on, if people that he admires and trusts and believes continue to draw a picture of him to himself that he is clumsy, he will feel that he is clumsy. His self-image will become one of being clumsy, and therefore he will act and behave as a clumsy person. So if this continued through his younger years, let's say Johnny's now 12 or 13 years old, he goes to his first little social get-together, and he sees Nancy across the room in a pretty white dress, and he thinks, wow, I want to go over and say hello to her. And so as he's practicing his self-talk with himself, what he's going to tell her, his self-image is getting a little disturbed. It's not being recognized. So it's saying, wait a minute, I feel a little dissonance here. We've been to this party for a half an hour and I haven't done anything clumsy. So as soon as Johnny starts moving across the room, he picks up a glass of punch and takes it over to Nancy. And sure enough, as he gets close to Nancy, he kind of stumbles and spills punch all over her. And of course, everybody, including himself, says, I'm so clumsy. Okay, so that gets imprinted more and more into his unconscious. And we'll talk about in a little bit the power that emotion has for that. So we self-regulate at our self-images.
I mean, like a golfer that says I'm a 10 handicap. And I once had a client that was like this, and every time he wanted to be able to shoot 10 over par. A handicap is what you shoot over par. It's usually a around a 72. So he usually shoots around an 82, and he wanted to be able to shoot, let's say, a 78 on this particular course. But every time I asked him how he did on the golf course, he said, I'm a 10 handicap. That means he shot 10 over par. And no matter what I talked to him about, he told me he was a 10 handicap. I said, when do you know, what happens? He said, well, I play the front nine pretty much at par. And then when I get to the back nine around the 13th or 14th hole, I seem to lose focus and concentration. And then I end up blowing up for 3 or 4 holes, and then finally the last 2 holes I'll pull it together, and I shoot 10 over par. And I said, well, do you ever shoot, do you ever start off poorly? He said, well, not as often, but occasionally I do. But if I start off poorly, I pull it together on the back nine, I shoot around par, and he said, after all, I'm a 10 handicap. So the point is, he had a self-image of himself as a 10 handicap. So no matter what he did, he's going to shoot around a 9, 10, or 11 above par. He's going to find a way to self-regulate at that self-image. Okay? Now, ways that we do this. This is all imprinted subconscious. There are several major functions that our brains do as part of our mind. The first one is homeostasis. You're familiar with homeostasis from your biology and so forth. That's the balance that we have in life. If you're too hot, you start sweating to cool the body down. If you're too cold, you start shivering to warm the body up. The body wants to stay in balance. And we want to keep that balance in how we look at things. Think of this also as the creative subconscious wants to keep that balance, keep that picture straight. That's a form of homeostasis. Next, there's Gestalt. Now, Gestalt's a good German word, and it means the whole or the pattern. We have a tendency to fill in the blanks. It's just like we think in pictures. So when you read that sentence earlier with all the misspelled words, you were still able to read the sentence because you got the whole picture. You pulled it in. And then another area that we become involved with is perceptual organization. And that's where we try to fix it. If things aren't right, we try to fix it. And again, this is another thing that the creative subconscious does. All of these things work within the creative subconscious. So if you look at this picture, what do you see? Most people will see, they usually say a man on a horse. Why a man? I'm not always sure. But there's a person on a horse. In actuality, it's just a bunch of blots, spots. But we have a tendency to fill in the blanks. We see the whole. And that's what Gestalt is. It's seeing the whole. Then the perceptual organization is when you look at this picture and you say, what's wrong with this picture? Something's not right. There's 3 pipes at the end, but when I look down at the right-hand side of the picture, there should only be 2. So your brain immediately says there's something wrong with this picture. Get involved with. When you're thinking about these self-images, think of like a mixing board on your stereo or something. They self-regulate. There's all these different self-images. They self-regulate. They move up and down within a certain range, just like the thermostat at your house. Okay, if you have it set on 72, it may get up to 74 or 76 before the air conditioner kicks on. If it goes down to 70 or 68, it'll go down 4 or 6 degrees before the heat kicks on. So you have a little range in there, and think of it as this continuum, and they're all balancing against and with each other. Now, some of them are prime programs, and they control the smaller ones. So if you think of this, it's all your self-images are kind of like this mixing board, and the bottom ones are the ones that are in the main control. All the others just adjust to it. So we've got all of this, and who's in charge of it? Remember, we live 80 to 90% of our lives in a subconscious state. We're not that aware. So it's the creative subconscious that's moving these controls and trying to keep them straight. Now, what can fool us at times are scotomas. Scotomas are blind spots. Okay, they're blocks in our vision. They're things that are right in front of our eyes that we don't see. It's kind of like on the right, the visual field, there's a blank spot in it. So what I want you to do is look at this next slide. You see on the right-hand side an Indian chief. You see an arrow, and then maybe a blueprint for a house over to the left. It looks like a hat standing on the end. And then what I want you to do is read the word that's there. There's a word contained in these symbols. Do you see it? What about if I put a bottom and a top on it? Do you now see it? It's white. It's the word fly. But we are so conditioned to read black on white, and of course I led you down the wrong path by having you focus on the indent or the arrow, and then telling you as a word that your self-talk probably said, I don't see a word, or I can't see a word, and you convinced yourself you couldn't see it. If you're an artist, there's a good chance you did see it because you've trained yourself to see the spaces between words. So this is called a negative print. It's white on black as opposed to black on white. And that's how a scotoma can reach us. Now, everybody has scotomas. There's nothing wrong with having them. We have to have them. That's how the reticular activating system blocks out certain information. It creates scotomas. So let's review the whole process of thought that we've been talking about. We have the mind, we have the computer, our supercomputer, our systems management. It gets its input from the five senses. That goes through the reticular activating system into the keyboard that gives it sanction, which goes into the screen where we perceive, associate, evaluate, and decide. And then remember, underneath all of that is the subconscious. That's the hard drive. Now, it takes in everything those five senses bring in. It also has a program, the creative subconscious, that works very closely with it to keep us sane, to keep the picture straight. This is all a huge feedback loop, okay? And again, it happens at lightning speed, so fast we can't think about it. Now, here's what I want you to do. This is your first homework assignment here. It's reticular activating homework assignment. The RAS system homework. I want you to look at this list of things. Note them. You've got them on your handout. And over the next several days, I want you to see how many of these items you can find. Now, the key is, I don't want you to go Google them or go in a book and look them up or anything else. I just want you to tell yourself consciously that you're looking for balloons. I'm looking for balloons. I'm looking for a ballerina. I'm looking for a black and white cow, a bulldog. I'm looking like a car. I'm looking for a car or a vehicle that's exactly like mine. I'm looking for a yellow submarine, and I'm looking for a white picket fence. I want you just to become aware of it. And just kind of carry a piece of paper around with you, and if you know, when you see one, you'll get a little aha. You'll get that Gestalt feeling. Oh, there's a white picket fence. My goodness, it's right next door. I hadn't seen it before. I hadn't even thought about it. So I want you to just find them by telling your reticular activating system to look for them. And then we'll talk about what to do with this later, but I want you to look for each of these and see if over the course of 2 to 3 days, how many of them you can find. And pay attention to what you see and how you think about it. So this is the end of the first part of the PowerPoint, the voiceover PowerPoint for cognitive psychology. Proceed to the next voiceover PowerPoint, self-talk.